Hi everybody, it's Professor Olney again. I'm here to make you another video. The video I'm going to make for you this time is about how to model an externality and how to determine the optimal size of the tax. There are 4 parts to this video, and what I'll do is I'll have a blank white screen in between each part so that if you want to go forward and just get to the particular part, just sort of scan until you see a blank white screen for about 5 seconds, and that's your signal that I've started the new part. The 4 parts of this video is, first I'm going to talk about, in general, how do we model a tax and how do we model a subsidy. That's something that we did earlier this semester, but I'll just review it relatively quickly. The second is we will look at a positive externality and how to determine the optimal size of a subsidy in order to encourage the proper or optimal amount of that behavior. Third, we'll look at a negative externality and how to determine the proper size or optimal size of a tax in order to generate the socially optimal quantity of that behavior. And then finally, I want you to think about the difference between the short run and the long run, and how, when we start thinking about the long run, that may change what we think is the optimal size of the tax. So that's the plan. Here we go. I've got my little whiteboard ready, and we're going to draw a bunch of pictures again. So here we go. First part. The first part I want to talk about is, in general, how do we model a tax and how do we model a subsidy? This is something that we've been doing all semester, so you've seen this multiple times before, but just to review and have it all in one place. Remember that if we're going to look at a tax, the first thing we have to decide is the tax remitted by the seller to the government, or is it remitted by the buyer? So remember, we had a previous video that looked at an excise tax. If you want to look at this in detail, I suggest you go back and review that particular video. So when the tax is remitted by the seller, that's the usual way in which we model a tax. We again always put price on the vertical and quantity on the horizontal axis. Start out with some downward sloping demand curve, I'll call it D1, some upward sloping supply curve, I'll call it S1, and in that case the equilibrium before the tax is price P1 and quantity Q1. If then there is a tax that's implemented and the tax money will be mailed to the government or transferred electronically to the government by the seller, then the tax is affecting the costs of selling the product to the seller. And so we show the effect of the tax by shifting the supply curve, and we would have a second supply curve which was equal to the first supply curve plus the amount of the tax. If the tax is a constant dollar amount, we'd have a parallel shift. If the tax is a percentage amount, then we would not have a parallel shift, we'd have a non-parallel shift. What I've drawn here is a parallel shift where the distance between these two supply curves is the amount T. And then we go on from there and figure out the equilibrium. Price would be P2, the new quantity sold would be Q2, the price that is retained by the buyers would be P2 minus T. And again, that's how we have modeled a tax in the past. On the other hand, if we want to look at how we would model a tax if it was remitted by the buyer, it's only slightly different. So once again, I'm going to start with my standard picture. I've got price on the vertical and quantity on the horizontal axis. I've got a downward sloping demand curve, D1, an upward sloping supply curve, S1. I've got my initial equilibrium, P1, and my initial equilibrium quantity, Q1. If the tax is remitted by the buyer, then the tax is affecting the buyer's price directly. It's affecting how much the buyer is willing and able to pay for this particular product. And so in this case, it's going to, when the tax is remitted by the buyer, it's going to be shown as affecting the demand curve. And so again, assuming that if the tax is a constant dollar amount, it would shift the demand curve down. That's supposed to be a parallel line. Go with me there. It would shift the demand curve down by the amount of the tax. And so D2, sorry I don't have a lot of space here, is equal to D1 minus the tax. The amount that the seller would receive would be the new equilibrium price. I'm going to call it PA because I don't want to use the same terminology I used on the left-hand side. That's the amount that the seller would receive, is that amount PA, but then the buyer has to also mail the tax money off to the government, and so for the buyer, the net amount paid by the buyer is the amount PA plus the tax. What we know is that that price P2 from the left-hand picture is the same as price PA plus the tax. that price P2 minus T from the left-hand graph is the same as the price PA. So the effect on how much is paid by the buyers, which is either P2 or PA plus the tax, the effect is the same. It's just a matter of who's mailing what check to whom. The amount that is retained by the buyer is the same. P2 minus T is equal to PA. It doesn't matter who's remitting the tax. So that's generally how we show the effect of a tax. And then to show a subsidy, again, we have to think about, is that subsidy received by the buyer or is the subsidy received by the seller? Excuse me. So on the first case on the left, I'm going to have a subsidy that's received by the buyer, and on the right, I'm going to have a subsidy that's received by a seller. So for example, in class, I gave the example of my buying my BART ticket each month. In that case, the subsidy is received by me. So I'm the one that's receiving the subsidy. It's a lower out-of-pocket cost for me to buy that $48 BART ticket. I'm only paying $22 out of pocket for that BART ticket. On the other hand, the subsidy sometimes is received by the seller. So if you think about education at a public university or college or other higher education institution, the subsidies there are received by the sellers, by the institution, and so we would model that as a subsidy received by the seller. So how do we show a subsidy? On the left, I'm going to put, again, price on the vertical, quantity on the horizontal, start with my downward sloping demand curve, D1, upward sloping supply curve, S1, initial equilibrium price, P1, initial equilibrium quantity, Q1. The subsidy that's received by the buyer is impacting the buyer's willingness and ability to pay. The buyer is willing to pay a higher price to the seller because they're going to receive a subsidy from the government. And so the distance here between the two demand curves would be equal to the subsidy. I'll call SUBS for subsidy. And so D2 is equal to D1 plus the subsidy. The effect is that the price that is price P2 that's received by the seller goes up. That's what induces the seller to sell additional quantity. The price that is the net price paid by the buyer is P2 minus the subsidy. So they gave the buyer some money, but they got some of that back from the government, and the equilibrium quantity rises to quantity Q2. We get the same result in terms of who's paying what and who's receiving what. If instead the subsidy is received by the seller, we just model it differently. So again, price on the vertical, quantity on the horizontal, an initial downward sloping demand curve, D1, upward sloping supply curve, S1, initial equilibrium, P1, and Q1. Now in this case, let's suppose that we have a subsidy, but this time the subsidy is received by the seller. If the subsidy is received by the seller, what that's doing is it's lowering the costs that the seller is incurring for producing and selling this product. And so the supply curve for the seller shifts down by the amount of the subsidy. So supply curve S2 is equal to supply curve S1 minus the amount of the subsidy. This vertical distance here is the subsidy. Again, just to make life easy, I've assumed a constant dollar subsidy. If it was a constant percent subsidy, the curves, instead of being parallel, would be askew a little bit. What happens? We have a new equilibrium price. I'll call it PA. That's the price that is received by the seller from the buyer. So that's the price that the buyer is paying. The total amount that's received by the seller is the price they receive from the buyer, the price PA, plus the subsidy. So PA plus the subsidy is the amount that's received in net by the seller. And what we have is that that price P2 that we had on the left-hand graph is the same as price PA plus the subsidy. The price P2 minus the subsidy, with a little bit of license there, is the same as the price PA. So it doesn't matter in terms of the effect on the price paid by the seller, paid by the buyer. It doesn't matter in terms of the price that's received by the seller. Those are going to be the same, whether we model this as the subsidy received by the buyer or received by the seller. Okay, so that was the first step. That was in general, how that was supposed to be quickly. It wasn't, but there you go. Quickly, in quotes, how do we model the effect of a tax or the effect of a subsidy? All right, next, part two. Part 2 is we want to look and see what's the optimal amount of a subsidy to provide in order to generate the socially optimal quantity of behavior in the presence of positive externalities. So to do that, the way that I like to draw it is by having two graphs that I stack on top of each other. Because the point of this exercise is to see if we can get to the right quantity. That is to say, the quantity that's the socially optimal quantity. And so if I stack the graphs vertically this way, then it's really easy for me to line up the quantities and look to see whether or not I have the right quantity. So on the top graph, I'm going to show the externality in the top graph. And the bottom graph is going to be the market in which whatever this product is sold. So in the top graph, I'm going to have marginal benefit and marginal cost on the vertical axis and the quantity on the horizontal axis. I've got some downward sloping private marginal benefit curve. I've got some upward sloping private marginal cost curve. And if they didn't take the external benefit into account, then the private optimum would be some quantity, I'll call it Q sub P, and the price at which that would be sold would be price P sub P. However, suppose that this is a market in which there is a positive externality, and that positive externality means there is some social external benefit that is received by society for this when others consume this product, and so we want to take that into account. So we have some social marginal benefit or some marginal, I always get my terminology wrong, sorry, my bad. The marginal external benefit, that's an E, and the sum of the private marginal benefit and the marginal external benefit is the social marginal benefit, so that's the private benefit plus the external benefit. And as I said in class, I flip around these letters. Sometimes I say marginal social benefit, and sometimes I say social marginal benefit. It doesn't really matter. Just get both of those words in there, and you're good. And once we take into account that there's some external benefit, what that tells us is that the optimal quantity, so I'm going to call that OPT for optimal, the optimal quantity, what society would like to see produced of this good, is greater than the privately optimal quantity. And it would be produced and sold at a higher price. I'll call it P. I'm running out of space. I'll stick in here optimal. In class, I called it P sub S for the social price. Okay, that's good. We're good there. So now we want to look at the bottom graph, which is the market. So now let's see what are the market forces that we can bring to bear so that the market generates this socially optimal quantity. If the market was left to its own devices, it would look like our usual market. So we would have a downward sloping demand curve that's frankly the same as that private marginal benefit curve. We'd have an upward sloping supply curve that's the same as that private marginal cost curve. We'd have a market equilibrium price, P1, and a market equilibrium quantity, Q1, that is the same as the private quantity. So initially we'd have quantity Q1, which is equal to the private optimal quantity. We, however, as a society, want to encourage a greater amount of this product because there are external benefits to the rest of us from people, say, getting educated. Just an example. All right, so how do we do that? We're going to do that with a subsidy. Let's do the subsidy. Let's assume that the subsidy is received by the buyer so that we're going to model it as shifting the demand curve. What we just saw was that when a subsidy is received by the buyer, that's going to take and shift the demand curve up by the amount of the subsidy because it generates a willingness and an ability to pay a higher price. So let me draw first. I'm going to do some drawing and erasing, which may make you a little crazy, but you can slide back and forth in the video so it'll still kind of be there even though it's gone. All right, so let's suppose that the government puts out an offer for a really small subsidy. So I'm going to call this D2, which is equal to D1 plus a small subsidy. In that case, in the market, there's going to be a new price. I'll call it price P2. There's going to be a new quantity. I'll call it quantity Q2. And the subsidy has increased the quantity that is produced and sold in the market. People are paying a higher price to the sellers, but remember that the net price that's paid by the buyers is P2 minus the subsidy. And so the buyers are paying a lower price on net. That's why they're willing to buy a greater amount of the product. The sellers are receiving a higher price, P2. That's why they're willing to produce a higher amount of the product. And we've made some progress because Q2 is greater than Q1. We're moving the quantity to the right. But notice that my subsidy is too small because right now that market equilibrium quantity Q2 is less than the optimal, the socially optimal quantity that we want to see of this product. We need a bigger subsidy. Well, let's suppose, let me see if I can erase just that. Okay, I'm back. I paused it while I did all that erasing. Let me get my lines back in here so that they look good. So there was my demand curve, there was my supply curve, S1, D1, my initial price P1, my initial quantity Q1. Okay, now I'm back. You just flipped to a new page, but we're good. All right, now let's suppose that the government offers a really big subsidy. So now I'm going to draw a huge subsidy. So here's the subsidy again. It's the distance between the two demand curves. So demand curve D2 is demand curve D1 plus the subsidy. And in that case, the market equilibrium quantity is going to be quantity Q3, where the second demand curve meets the first supply curve. The amount that the sellers will receive will be the price P3, but the net price to the buyers, once they receive the subsidy, is really P3 minus the subsidy. So the consumers are paying less on net. P3 minus the subsidy is lower than the price P1, and that's why they're willing to buy more. The sellers are receiving more. They're receiving P3 instead of P1. That's why they're willing to produce more. But now our subsidy is too big. The quantity Q3 certainly is bigger than the original market quantity, but the subsidy is too big, which means that the quantity Q3 is bigger than the optimal quantity. So I think of this as the Goldilocks story. First it was too small, and then it was too big, and now we're going to find the subsidy that's just right. So how do we find the subsidy that's just right? Well, first, I paused you, and I take a minute to erase all of these marks. So hold on, let me do that. Okay, we're back. Hello, I'm back. All right, so now we're trying to find the optimal size of the subsidy. Well, you've probably guessed. The optimal size of the subsidy is going to be if the subsidy exactly equals the marginal external benefit, then the market will generate a quantity that's exactly equal to the socially optimal quantity. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to shift my demand curve by the amount of the subsidy, where that subsidy is equal to the marginal external benefit that I drew in my top graph, the externality graph. So let me draw a new demand curve, D2 plus the right, just right subsidy. Now the quantity that's going to be produced in the market, big dots so that you make sure it lines up right. The quantity that's going to be produced in the market will be quantity Q4. Quantity Q4, again, is bigger than the original quantity because we've provided the subsidy to the buyers. And voila, quantity Q4 equals the socially optimal quantity. Those two quantities are equal because the subsidy exactly equals the marginal external benefit. And the price that is paid by the buyers to the sellers is price P4. That higher price induces the sellers to increase the quantity that they are producing. The net price to the buyers, though, is P4 minus the subsidy. And the fact that P4 minus the subsidy is less than the price P1 is what induces the buyers to purchase a greater amount of this product, which is what moves us to the market equilibrium quantity Q4, which is equal to the socially optimal quantity. So, bottom line, in a positive externality, if we want the market to generate the amount of the socially optimal amount of the product, then we need a subsidy. It can be paid to the buyers or to the sellers. It does not matter who it's paid to, but the subsidy needs to be equal to the amount of the marginal external benefit. Okay, good. You probably have a hunch then as to how this next one's going to go. So next what we want to look at is how do we show the way that the market can find the socially optimal quantity when there's a negative externality. So once again, I'm going to draw two pictures. The top picture is going to have the externality in it, and the bottom picture will have the market. And in this case, I'm showing a negative externality. Let me add that word, negative. So that we've got it. Okay. In the top, on the vertical axis, I've got marginal benefit and marginal cost. On the horizontal, I've got quantity. In the bottom picture, I've got price on the vertical and quantity on the horizontal. I go back and forth between uppercase and lowercase. It means nothing. They're both Q's for quantity. What do we have? We have a downward sloping private marginal benefit curve, which is the same as the downward sloping demand curve in the market. We've got an upward sloping private marginal cost curve, which is the same as the supply curve in the market. We've got an initial equilibrium quantity, the privately optimal quantity in the top picture. I have to move I didn't draw that quite right, so let me move this one so that I get it lined up right. There, all right. Yeah, there we go, big dot. Always make a big dot so it works out. In the market, there we go. The quantity Q1 is the equilibrium quantity in the market. It's going to be sold at a price P1. That price P1 happens to equal the privately optimal price that we see in the model of the externality on top. This is the way everything would be if there was no externality. But suppose there's a negative externality. If there's a negative externality, that means that there is some cost that is incurred by society that is in addition to the costs that are incurred by the seller. So that means that there is some marginal damage cost that is in addition to the private costs. Again, just because I want to make my life easy, I'm going to assume that the marginal damage cost is a constant dollar amount regardless of the quantity. It just means it's easier for me to draw it because now I've got parallel lines. So my second curve here is the social marginal cost. Remember that the social marginal cost is the sum of the private marginal cost and that marginal damage cost, or the external cost. So it's the private plus the external cost creates the social marginal cost. Or the marginal social cost, if you want to switch it around and call it MSC, that's okay too. What that tells us is that if society were to see the quantity produced that they want to see of this product, that quantity would be what I called Q sub opt. That would be the optimal quantity to society that would take into account the social costs and not just the private costs of production. That quantity would be sold at a price PS. How do we bring that about in the market? A tax. So we're going to have a tax, and the tax is how we're going to change the amount that is produced in the market. Remember that we could apply the tax either to have it paid by the seller or paid by the buyer. I'm going to have it paid by the seller, so what it's going to do is it's going to shift my supply curve. I think you probably know where I'm going to go. If the tax is too small, it's going to shift my supply curve only a little bit. So that's supply 1 plus a small tax. And then the new equilibrium quantity, Q2, is less than the original equilibrium quantity. We're moving in the right direction, but it's still too big. It's still larger than the optimal quantity. So if you compare Q2 in the bottom with Q opt in the top, that tax is too small. If, on the other hand, we have a really big tax, so I have a huge tax so that I have S1 plus a big tax, then the market is going to generate a quantity Q3, and when the tax is too big, that quantity Q3 is going to be smaller than the optimal quantity. That tax is too big. It's bigger than is necessary for the market to generate a quantity that's the socially optimal quantity. So what do we need? We need a tax that's just right, of course. What's the size of the tax that's just right? Are you thinking Goldilocks? The size of the tax that's just right is to set the tax equal to the marginal damage cost. And when we do that, the new market equilibrium quantity will exactly equal the optimal quantity. So if I shift my supply curve, I've got a lot of labels here. Let me pull this label over here. This is S1 plus a just right tax, where that just right tax is equal to the marginal damage cost. In that case, the market's going to generate a quantity Q4. That's exactly equal to the socially optimal quantity. The product is going to be sold at a price P4. That's the price that the buyers have to pay, and because they're paying a higher price, the buyers are moving along their demand curve. They don't want to buy as much of the product. The sellers are remitting that tax to the government, and so what the sellers are keeping is the price P4 minus the tax. Because they're keeping a smaller price, the sellers are not willing to produce as much of the product. The amount of the product that they're willing and able to supply is quantity Q4, which remember was the optimal quantity. Voila, we've done it. We have a tax that's just the right size, so it's the optimal tax. It's the optimal size or the optimal tax, and it generates an output in the market that is equal to the socially optimal output. This is called a Pigouvian tax. I think that's such a funny name. It's named after an economist from a long time ago named Pigou, and so they call it a Pigouvian tax because it's a tax that's designed to move the market to the social optimum in the presence of negative externalities. All right, so that was part 3. How do we model a negative externality? Here comes the interesting part, which I've never seen in any textbook, but I want you to think about. I think the interesting part is thinking about what about the short run versus the long run? Because everything that I've just done here is all short run stuff. So let me put the blank screen there. Whoops, that wasn't what I was supposed to do. Let me do that. There, put the blank screen so for people who are sliding forward, they find me. So I want to think now about what about in the long run? Is that still the optimal size of the tax in the long run, or is it only the optimal size of the tax in the short run? And which tax is the right tax to set? Is it the tax that's optimal in the short run or the tax that's optimal in the long run? All right, so the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to actually do 3 graphs this time. So I'm going to have my externality graph here on the top like I had in the previous picture. And on the bottom left, I'm going to have the market graph. I'm going to put that label down. Where am I going to put that label? I'll put that label over here. And then we're going to do like we did when we did long-run competitive equilibrium. And let's put a firm graph over here on the bottom right next to the market graph. Lots going on. Okay, you ready? So externality, we've got marginal benefit and marginal cost on the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal axis. We've got some downward sloping marginal benefit curve, some upward sloping private marginal cost curve. There is, let's see, that generates a private optimum QP that would be sold at a private price P sub P. That corresponds to, dashing it down, that corresponds to demand in the market, I'll call it D1, and supply in the market, I'll call it S1. That would generate a quantity Q1 that's sold at a price P1. And for the firm, that corresponds to, so this is a firm in a perfectly competitive industry, that corresponds to, at that price P1, they have the individual firm's demand curve, which as we know is equal to their marginal revenue curve, MR1. They have their standard, good old upward sloping marginal cost curve, and we'll start them in long-run competitive equilibrium with the average total cost 1, like so. So my firm is producing a quantity Q1. Oh, I suppose now I do care about upper and lower case. Let me change this Q on my upper left to a uppercase Q, because that's the whole market. And then over here on the right, where I have lower right, where I have the firm, I've got my lowercase q, just to remind us that this lowercase q is in tens and the uppercase q is in 10,000s. Okay, so that's our start. We're good, right? We're good. All right, now we're going to add to this a negative externality. So I'm going to add a negative externality, which means I've got a marginal damage cost. And so the social marginal cost curve is equal to the private marginal cost plus the marginal damage cost. That means the socially optimal quantity, Q opt, optimal quantity. The socially optimal quantity is less than the private quantity. It would be sold at this higher price PS. The market's not going to generate that quantity on its own, so what do? So previous slide, what we saw was we implement a tax that's equal to the marginal damage cost. That's the standard thing that you read in every textbook. Okay, so we're going to implement a tax that is equal to Oopsie. Let me erase right there. I made it oopsie. Whoopsie. There. S2 is equal to, there we go, S1 plus the tax, where the tax is equal to the marginal damage cost. That means in the market, we're going to wind up with, big dot so it lines up, we're going to line up with a quantity Q2 that sold at a price P2 in the short run. The seller is going to keep only P2 minus T. Come on over to the right. Let's look at what that means for the firm. The reason our supply curve shifted up was because, and this amount was the tax, was because the marginal cost curve shifted up by the same amount. So I have MC2, which equals MC1 plus the tax. And that also meant my average total cost shifted up. So I've got ATC2, which is ATC1 plus the tax. All right? And when those costs increased and the firms tried to pass those costs on to the customers, the equilibrium price went up to P2. So let me dash that over. I've got price P2. I've got my new marginal revenue. I'll call it MR2, which means over here on the right, the typical firm in this industry is now going to produce a quantity Q2, sell it at a price P2, but for that typical firm, go up until you find the average total costs. I forgot to label that axis, tisk, tisk. I forgot to label that axis, tisk, tisk, twice. Label that ATC of producing Q2. This typical firm is now incurring a loss. What do we know? Well, you know what we know. I'll tell you anyway. What we know is that in the long run, some of these firms will exit. Some of those firms are going to exit in the long run, and when firms exit in the long run, that's going to shift the supply curve a second time. The supply curve is going to shift a second time, so here's S3 equals, which is due to, let me just say due to, I have too many words here. S3, which reflects the exit of some of the firms. Now what do we got? Now at S3, we're going to have a price P3. That price P3, if I drew it right, I didn't quite do it right, so I'm going to draw a big dot. That price P3 has risen by the full amount of the tax, and so P1 is P3 minus the tax. But here's the interesting point. What's happened to the quantity? The quantity sold in the market's gone down further, and now the quantity is too small. So we did a tax equal to the MDC. So in the short run, we had the market quantity, Q2, was equal to the socially optimal quantity. We were happy, right? Perfect. Everything's peachy. But in the long run, not so happy. Because in the long run, due to the exit of these firms that are incurring losses, we're going to be at quantity Q3, which is far less than the socially optimal quantity. So then the question becomes for the policymaker. So here we are, we're just doing this Econ 1 stuff, but imagine that you're a policymaker. So you get a job working for the state of California, you get a job working for the city of Berkeley, for the county of Alameda, for the federal government, for whatever. You get a public policy job, and one of the things that you're supposed to figure out is what's the optimal size of a tax to impose on, let's say, let me think, the soda market, in order to move the market optimum, or the market equilibrium, to the socially optimal quantity. If you're trying to figure out what size of a tax to impose in a soda market, do you want to move the tax? Do you want to set the tax so that you move the quantity to the social optimum in the short run? Or do you want to set the tax so that you move the quantity in the market to the social optimum in the long run? Those are two different quantities. That's what we figured out in the previous part of the course, that the price is going to rise until the people are paying the full amount of the tax. There'll be fewer firms in the industry. The quantity will continue to fall. I think that the answer to that question of do you want to set the tax equal to the MDC in the short run, or do you want a smaller tax in the short run because there's going to be these long run effects? I think the answer to that question probably depends upon how long is the long run. Is this a market that's going to achieve the long run in a matter of weeks or months? So that if there are firms that are incurring losses, they're going to be exiting, and that exit's going to take place between now and, say, the end of the calendar year, then probably you want to think about the long run when you're setting how big the tax should be in the presence of a negative externality. On the other hand, if this is a market where the long run is years and years and years and years, where it would take somebody or a firm 10 years to unload all of its equipment and to exit from the industry, in that case, setting the tax equal to the long run, what's optimal in the long run, probably is going to generate too much of the bad activity, even in the short run, which is going to last a long time, a decade. So those are thorny questions. I haven't seen them addressed in any textbook, but I think they're really interesting. And I think they're well worth pondering and thinking about, and that's part of what I asked you to do on the problem set during fall 2017. This video will live into perpetuity, but for those of you in the future, by the way, in fall 2017, we grappled with this question on the problem set. Future semesters, who knows what question I'll put on the problem set. Thank you all very much. You guys have a great day, and I'll see you in class.